Hey everyone, and welcome to the Tom's Hardware Show. I'm your host Sharon Harding, and today we're getting into the new Radeon RX 6600 XT graphics card, as well as our test results for AMD's Ryzen 5 5600G APU. So welcome everyone. We are live as always, which means we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, just feel free to drop that question into the chat, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you're watching this live, and we'll try to discuss it on air. So with me today is Tom's Hardware Deputy Managing Editor, Paul Alcorn. What's going on, Paul?
Nothing much. Another busy day.
Of course. And of course, we wouldn't do a GPU launch without Tom's Hardware Senior GPU Editor, Jared Walton. How are you, Jared?
Good. How's it going?
Going well. I think my AC isn't working, so let's hope that fixes itself. Yes, keep your fingers crossed for me or it's going to get gross on this live stream. Anyway, Jared, thanks so much for joining us. I know this week AMD added a new card to its RX 6000 series lineup, the 6600 XT. This one is powered by Navi 23 GPU, limited to 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and kind of serves as a more value-oriented option with an MSRP of $379. Obviously, the GPU, yes. With the shortage, finding cards at all, let alone at MSRP, is an ongoing struggle, of course. But Jared, I know you actually have a few cards on hand. Can we check them out?
Yeah. So I'll start with the card that I've reviewed. This was sent by AMD for the official launch. This is the ASRock Phantom Gaming D 8 gig OC, if you want the full name, 8G OC. It's, triple slot cooler. It's 2.4 slot thickness. Got the usual complement of 3 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI port. And the interesting thing about this card, and actually this applies to all of the RX 6600 XT cards, is they're super aggressive on the fan speed ramp down. It's a 160 watt, 180 watt card, depending on the model. And the fans will stop when the card is below about 55 Celsius, maybe 58 degrees Celsius. It's somewhere in that range. And so, I'm used to seeing cards take, I don't know, a minute or two before the fan would stop when you exit a game. These, it's instant. They go off in 2 seconds. I'm like, wow, that's pretty quick, because they don't use a lot of power. Second card, this is the Sapphire Pulse. Also, I believe this one's also supposed to be MSRP 380. Same ports, 3 DisplayPort, 1 HDMI. And this one is, I don't think it's more than 2 slot thickness. It'd be a tight fit maybe, but if you had something right next to it. And then the third card is a Gigabyte Eagle. This is their MSRP model. So triple fan, despite let me get this the right way up. So this logo looks like it might light up, but it actually doesn't. There's no lighting at all on this card, which some people actually would like. The interesting thing is it's kind of loud, not horribly loud, but it's louder than the other two, which, you'd think with a triple fan cooler, that wouldn't be the case, but it does get a little louder. This one takes the alternative of 2 HDMI ports and 2 display ports. I think they're both HDMI 2.1, so, it's maybe a little forward-looking compared to, DisplayPort's been the standard for so long, but HDMI 2.1 is technically a higher bandwidth interface than DisplayPort 1.4, which is what Big Navi and Ampere support. So that's the 3 cards. All of those are, as far as I'm aware, I might have this wrong on one of them, but I think they're all supposed to start at $380. So they're not the fancy, overclocked. They are overclocked, but they're not the super overclocked RGB blinged out expensive models. The ASRock Phantom does have RGB lighting on it though. So the middle fan lights up, as does the Phantom Gaming logo, and I think there's some lighting around the edges there that lights up as well. Anyway, so that's the 3 cards. Should we talk performance? Any questions so far, Sharon? Paul?
I've got plenty. Well, let's start because we just talked about pricing a bit already. So 380 MSRP. I read in your review though. So let's say you can find these cards right at MSRP. What do you think about that price for what you're getting?
If it were a normal market, it would be too high. Like flat out, it's too expensive. But so I actually went to Micro Center. I live in Colorado now. There's a Micro Center in Denver. It's an hour drive away, but I went there, and they said they got around 100, maybe more than 100 at this store location. And when I got there, there was still, I would say, at least 50 sitting on store shelf behind a glass case, and like you can't get the card yourself. You have to ask for help, and then the guy who helped me, he has to like carry the card around for me until I check out. I was like, can I just take the card so you can like go back to work or whatever? He's like, oh no, I have to hang on to it. I was like, are you serious? You're only allowed 1 GPU purchase at Micro Center right now per 30 days. And they check your ID. They, do all that stuff, which is, if you're trying to stop mining firms from acquiring all of these cards, that's a good way of doing it. The cards didn't sell out instantly in store, but online, Newegg had their shuffle with a bunch of cards up. I don't know how many of you guys tried for it. I tried. I didn't get picked. I know Matt said he did get the option to buy one of the cards. I don't know which one. I
tried. I was not selected.
Yeah. So, Paul, did you give it a shot on the Newegg shuffle yesterday?
No, I don't want one. I've got one.
You don't have to buy it. I just wanted you all to like try so that we could say, hey, we had 10 people try.
I was busy doing something.
Yeah, you shaving your head, Mr. Clean. Anyway, so that's 1 out of 3 for sure got picked, but 2 of us at least didn't get picked, and that's not great odds. And I think the odds are probably a lot worse than 1 in 3 getting picked. I think it's probably like 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. Like Newegg doesn't tell you how many cards of each model they have available, and like I selected every card, so there were 12 or 14 options on Newegg, and some of those, like I think the Asus model was like $550 or $580 for the ROG Strix, and there's no way I would buy that even if I had the option. Like personally, some people love Asus, and I get that, but I wouldn't pay $550 for a blinged up 6600 XT. Anyway. Performance-wise, it's a little bit faster than an RX 5700 XT, which launched 2 years ago at $400 and was regularly available for $325, $350 for probably the next year or so before the shortages started happening and everything sold out and prices skyrocketed. There are cases where the 5700 XT is faster than the 6600 because it has more memory bandwidth, but it doesn't have the new RDNA 2 stuff, the new architectural stuff. It doesn't have Infinity Cache. So it's kind of a wash. So like 1080p, the 6600 XT wins by like 10 or 15%. 1440p, it's closer, like 8%. And then at 4K, it swapped places. So, I mean, I don't think any people are really hoping for 4K gaming on a what it should be a mid-range card. It's priced like the bottom of the high-end market, but it's mid-range hardware. So, it's decent, and I should say it's also about 12% faster than a GTX 3060 at 1080p. 8% faster at 1440p, and a little bit slower at 4K again. So, it's this balancing the trade-off thing architecturally and cost and chip size and all that. And I think, I'm actually surprised that it performs as well as it does, considering it only has 8 gigabytes, not so much the 8 gigabytes, but the 128-bit memory interface. So, like, that's the same memory interface as an RX 5500 XT, but this card is I want to say it's almost twice as fast as a 5500 XT. So, architectural enhancements and that infinity cache really did help. So.
Yeah, that 128-bit bus is something that Sal Drex in our comments is also complaining about. They argue that pretty much makes its MSRP a joke, as they put it. Can you talk about, like during your testing, like what did you notice? How did that actually affect actual gameplay?
So, there's a lot of games that work just fine in 8 gigabytes of memory. I would say most games will, especially at 1080p, it's not a problem. Ironically, the games that are most likely to exceed that 8 gigabytes are games that AMD promoted for their other big Navi cards. So like Godfall and Dirt 5 and Borderlands 3, maybe a little bit. There's, I would say, but it's more Godfall is really brutal if you don't have 12 gigabytes of memory. Even at 1080p, it can be a little finicky. So it was kind of interesting. Like the games that performed relatively worse on the card were games that perform a lot better on like the 6700 XT. The price is, it is what it is. It's what the market is kind of dictating. I know people are upset about that. And I was honestly surprised that Micro Center is selling them at whatever the card manufacturers have set as their MSRP, which several of the cards are set at AMD's $380. But online, after the initial wave of cards, I think most cards are going to be going for that 500 plus range, and at that point, it's like, yeah, I guess they're targeting miners again, or hoping to get bought by miners. And as a mining card, like I hate to say it, but it's not bad. It's interesting because the 128-bit bus comes into play. It only does about 32 mega hash per second for Ethereum. Until December when Ethereum goes proof of stake, right? But so that's the best card or best coin for it. But the catch is after tuning, like I dropped the GPU maximum clock down to 50% because it doesn't need all that GPU clock speed, and that cut the power draw while mining to about 75 watts, and that's real power draw. It's not like the software reported, which was actually 60 watts, but it was 75 watts, and you go, okay. 32 mega hash for 75 watts. That's the equivalent of 64 mega hash for 150 watts, which is pretty much exactly half of what you get with an RX 6800. The only catch being you have to use 2 of the cards to get there. So I think it's less convenient for a mining firm that's trying to build out a lot of PCs and cards, because they'd have to have twice as many PCs. But I still think mining is going to be a threat on this card as long as it's profitable. And I mean, to me, I'm like, it's $2.25 per day profitability on a 32 mega hash card, which like that doesn't seem like much at all. But apparently to some people, they're like, yeah, if I scale up and do hundreds of cards, that's a lot of money, and we'll do it and hopefully break even. So,
well, Ethereum was over, let's see what the real time pricing is, but I know it was over $3,200 yesterday. Today it's at 3,000, 3,050. I mean, anything over that 3,000 range, you can forget it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially with the proof of stake stuff coming on the Ethereum 2.0 stuff. Will that actually drop Ethereum's price significantly, or will it cause the price to go up, or will it get delayed again? Because Ethereum's been talking about proof of stake for, I think, more than a year, and it still hasn't shifted. So
I think personally, I'm no expert, but personally what I would expect is that even if it does go off without a hitch, all of a sudden you have all of this unused mining capacity for GPUs out there in the world, just from normal folks. And I think that you would just see another coin, this GPU mine, jump up and take place, because I mean they'll skyrocket in popularity almost immediately.
Yep, you'll have a bunch of hash rate thrown at other coins. I mean, it's happening now already.
Yeah, there might be a period of fuzziness where it's kind of, there's these 4 or 5 coins that are popular, but eventually Nice Hash will probably declare the victor, and I would imagine it'll just move elsewhere.
Well, it's like, I tested the 3080 Ti last month, 2 months ago. What has it been? Anyway, 3080 Ti has NVIDIA's hash rate limiter in there, which limits it to 60 mega hash, 62, something like that per second on Ethereum. But it doesn't affect Kapow. It doesn't affect Octopus. There's a bunch of other mining algorithms that that the limiter doesn't affect. And so I want to say like one of the Kapow coins or Octopus coins are the ones that end up paying the best on it. And it was like, I think it was like 25% less than what Ethereum was paying if you were mining Ethereum, but it wasn't low enough that miners wouldn't buy the cards. So it ends up being like, I don't know, like when does cryptocurrency go away and stop stealing all the GPUs? It goes away when the price goes low enough and people stop believing in it, and so the miners don't see profit in it.
Yeah, I don't think it. Yeah, I think they'll just need to improve production, because I'm pretty sure that this is going to be a problem for years to come. We'll see. Hopefully not.
So we had a quick question from Tim. I'm sorry I didn't get to this earlier, but just a quick one. Jared, when you were referring to video port, did you mean VGA or DVI?
I'm not sure if he's being funny or serious, but VGA is of course VGA is of course the old standard. So the new cards, let's see, these are HDMI. These are DisplayPort, and I don't see many cards with DVI or VGA ports these days. VGA is pretty well and dead.
Those are sRGB ports, I thought.
Yeah.
We're going back even further.
I want my S-Video port. I remember having an old ATI card with an S-Video out and trying to hook it up to my TV, my old style 640 a 640 interlaced TV that looked horrible when trying to read text. Yeah,
we should have an episode.
Were great.
We should have an episode dedicated to all the lost ports that we miss. Do a special VGA episode and the like. All right. So Jared, assuming you could find this card and you have, good options and can actually shop, who would you recommend this card for? Like what type of gamer or what type of, enthusiast seeking X type of performance? Like where does it, kind of fit in the stack?
So, I said it basically matches, maybe beats slightly the RX 5700 XT, which if we're talking about other GPUs, I'm going to pull this up just so I can get the right numbers here. But I want to say like the GTX 1080 Ti offers a similar level of performance. The Radeon 7 is right in that same ballpark. There's a lot of cards that land right around the same level of performance, but the older cards use more power. So, that's kind of, it's like, oh yeah, well this thing uses 170 watts of power or whatever, and performs as well as, let's see, I want to say it's the RTX 2070 is kind of right in that same performance range. Yeah. So, oh no. So, where am I? Where's my 6600? Oh, I might be looking at no. I opened up a spreadsheet and my 6600 is not in this spreadsheet, which is weird because the spreadsheet says it is. But anyway, it's right at the level of the 5700 XT GTX 1080 Ti, a little bit ahead of the 2070, the RTX 2070, a little bit behind the RTX 2070 Super. So anything that those can play, this card would be mostly just as fast. It does better at 1080p. AMD has said that this is a 1080p focused card, but doesn't mean you can't play at 1440p. And on less demanding titles, 4K is going to work as well. But the 32 meg Infinity Cache becomes a bit more of a limiting factor if you're playing at higher resolutions. So, GTX 1080 Ti is what, like 5 years old now? I think 4 years. I might be off on that, but that was a $700 card. So for about half the price, 4 years later, you're getting a similar level of performance with newer features and using 35% less power. But if you already have anything at like the RTX 2070 or RX 5700 XT level or above, then this would be a slower card, and I wouldn't upgrade to it. You'd only want to upgrade if you're running like a GTX 1060 or an RX 580 or one of those older cards. And then the painful thing there is like, hey, I'm upgrading from a $250 card and I want a $250 card, but those don't exist right now. Actually, at Micro Center, I laughed because the only other GPU that was in stock was a GTX 1050 Ti, and they wanted $300 for those. I was like, what? I looked at the associate. I'm like, are you serious? Like, you've got a $380 brand new GPU next to a card that's like less than half as fast, and you're still asking $300 for it. He's like, well, yeah. You could see he was like, please don't ask me about that. That it's bad.
I don't set the prices, sir. Sorry, I just work here.
Exactly.
So look, guys, we have a couple VGA users. Dylan Naidu uses VGA at work, and Gaming Zone also uses VGA.
I'm not dissing VGA. I still have VGA myself here and there.
I am. I don't like digital. I don't like analog connections. Like, I remember the old VGA when you got to play with pin cushioning and trapezoidal distortion and all those things. I'm like, man, when I went to LCDs back in 2004, I'm like, I'm done with CRTs. And I know some people are like, oh, but they have better latency and such. And I hear that, but for
they're
me,
making a huge resurgence with retro console gamers, stuff like that. I love CRT.
I like I had a 100-pound 21-inch CRT back in the 90s, and I don't miss it.
So with servers, almost all servers have VGA. So I have like 3 VGA little monitors and little tiny ones. And I just use them to, configure the BMC, which with servers, you don't need to use the screen unless you're configured. You do it all over the internet, over your LAN. But anyway, I still use them.
Yeah, VGA, plug those into your old KVM switches. That's probably good use for it still.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to check out some modern tech, I will share Jared's review for the 6600 XT in the chat right now. But if you have any other questions for Jared, definitely drop them in. He is the expert. We could poke his brain live on air. In the meantime, Paul, you've been continuing your saga of Cezanne testing with the final detailed look at the AMD Ryzen 5 5600G. So last week we talked about the 5700G, which was basically your fastest option for integrated graphics. But the 5600G, kind of like the 6600 XT, is kind of a more value-oriented option again. So we're talking 6 cores, 12 threads, a 3.9 gigahertz clock speed that can boost to 4.4, and a $259 MSRP. So, Paul, you're calling it the value iGPU gaming king. Based on your testing, what are the best uses, or what type of workloads or enthusiasts would this chip best serve?
Well, it's a strange time to be building PCs. So APUs, it's actually an extremely well-timed launch from AMD. The big thing about it, the reason why I say it's the value king, is because it offers you roughly about, if you're looking at integrated graphics gaming performance, it offers roughly 95 or a little bit more % of the performance that you'll get on a the 5700G, the more expensive model, but for 30% less cash. So you get 95% of the gaming performance, maybe even a little more, but for $100 less. You can't beat that. Unless you're overclocking, you're not going to, the 5700G has a lot more headroom there because it has an extra compute unit and it has more CPU cores. But with this class of chip at this price range, you're not really going to be turning the screws very hard on either of them, because you'd have to spend so much on expensive memory or on a more robust cooler that it just doesn't make sense for this class of chip. I mean, it could push you up into another chip tier if you're doing that, or give you more money for your GPU instead. So there's basically 3 potential use cases for this chip. One is just to buy it and use it as a non-X variant. And I don't buy AMD's positioning as a non-X. So in the past, when you have like a 3600X, you would have, that's the more expensive Ryzen 5 3600. Then you would have the Ryzen 5 3600, which is called the non-X model. And basically, it's kind of the same story there, where you, with a minimum of time invested, you can get 95% of the performance from the non-X model that you can get from the X model, but for significantly less money. AMD is, as you can tell, this is the 5600G. The more expensive model is the 5600X. I mean, of course, they're completely different chips, but AMD is saying that this essentially will serve as the non-X model. So you save some money and you can use this instead of a 5600X. That just doesn't hold water in our test.
You know who it holds water for, though?
Marketing?
OEMs.
Yeah, it probably does.
Businesses and OEMs will love having a good integrated graphics solution so that they don't have to throw in a GPU.
Yeah, but then what they do is they ship them with a single stick of memory. And as we covered in our other reviews, and the testing, I left it in this review, the testing is there. You'll see on integrated graphics where we tested with one stick versus two. They shipped an OEM system to us with one stick, and it cuts performance in half. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah, you know, and when you buy the system, they don't tell you they're shipping it with one stick. They say, okay, 16 gigs. But if you configure it with 32 gigs, they still ship it to you with one stick. There is no
32 gig DIMM is like, those aren't even cheap. Like,
yeah, it's ridiculous. There is no option for two DIMMs, and regardless of how they package it, it's not very good for the end user. It's a crippled system. So
hopefully some of the OEMs listen to this and manage to convince their managing people and say, hey, you know what? We got to stop doing the single DIMMs on 16 gig and above.
You do see vendors every now and then mentioning whether or not, like, how many DIMMs they're using, but it's normally like the higher end or maybe like the gaming focused ones will they'll care to get into detail like that.
Yeah. So
I mean, in terms of dedicated graphics cards too, like Paul and I both kind of poked at this, or I poked at it more than Paul probably, but you know, the integrated graphics on a 5600G, 5700G, they're not as fast as a GTX 1050, but they're like 2/3 of the way there, maybe 3/4. Yeah. They're faster than the GT 1030. So, you know, it's not like a screaming fast GPU, but it's serviceable. You can play most games at 30 frames per second or more at 1080p. So
yeah,
it's not too bad.
So another big potential use case for this is just to use it as a stopgap solution, to where you buy it and you use the integrated graphics for now until the GPU shortage recedes, and then you can buy a GPU and pair it with it. That, you know, holds a little bit more water. With the 5700G, the more expensive model, I don't really like the thought of that because it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense once you actually test systems competing like price systems with a discrete GPU, especially if you're looking at secondhand. But with this chip, this would actually make some sense here. It would make sense given the current state of things, because it's priced so low, you're not going to get any real good combos of a chip and a used, you know, a real low end discrete GPU that's going to give you quite the performance. And if you drop in a discrete GPU, this does pretty decent at pushing it along. I mean, it's no 5600X. It's not even close, to be honest. But I think
it still has a full. It has a full 16-lane PCI Express connection this time, which is nice.
Correct.
But it is PCIe Gen 3 on the APUs, right?
Yep. So that's that is one drawback to them, is Gen 3. But you know, it depends upon what you do as whether or not you're going to notice that or value having PCIe 4.0. But for things like file transfers, and if you do any type of maybe more heavy work in applications, things like Photoshop, encoding, video encoding, things like that, you would notice. I don't know that you'd be doing that with this class of chip a lot, but file transfers everybody does every single day. So there is that. I think with this class of chip, you can get away with PCIe 3.0 easier, a little bit easier for sure. So I mean,
buy overall, the APU and wait for RDNA 3.
Pretty much. I mean, overall, it's a pretty good chip. We found that performance from the integrated graphics is just largely constrained by memory speed. If you get these chips and overclock, like I overclocked it to push into memory to DDR4000. I wasn't getting much of an improvement from pushing the CPU core clocks, so I just stuck with PBO, which is kind of like an overclock light, and focused on the GPU clocks and on the memory. And overclocking memory on these really significantly boosts performance. It's quite fantastic. and we went up to DDR4 4000. We could have easily went higher and stayed within what's called a 1-1 mode, which is the coupled mode, which is ideal. But I just stopped at 4000 because anything over that, the memory is going to get pretty expensive for this class of chip.
Yeah, at that point, you just buy a dedicated GPU because, hey, if you're willing to spend $300 on memory.
Yeah, at that point, you're crossing that line, right? Like if you're really into overclocking chips and you just want a chip to play with, this thing's fun. I mean, it's hard though, because you have to, balancing overclocking CPU cores, GPU cores, the memory, and the fabric. Because with AMD, you have to overclock the fabric, is very challenging. But you can get some really great results. It has surprising headroom. It's really great. And oddly enough, I think that AMD kind of released this at a good time. If they can keep stock, which let's see if it's in stock. Right now is a really good time because nobody can buy a GPU. So, or at least not all GPUs. So, or GPUs that are in super duper high demand. So when you look at it, AMD's Ryzen GPUs right now I just checked it earlier while we were speaking, all of Ryzen's CPUs, of the Ryzen 5000 are either at or below MSRP, which is shocking, especially when some of them are $50 off on Amazon right now. Like the 5800X is $50 off. The reason why those chips are not in a shortage anymore is because people can't build PCs because they can't get the other components at a reasonable price, like the GPU. So all of a sudden, AMD is pretty much giving away or not being able to charge a premium for their Ryzen 5000 chips and running sales on them because people aren't buying them. But this makes perfect sense at this point in time. Actually, oddly enough, it might be a really, really smart move. I was thinking that AMD wouldn't keep much stock of these, but right now you can buy the 5600X for $289 or the 5600G, excuse me, the APU we're talking about. And the 5700G is also available. Both of them are still available, which is surprising. I assumed AMD was going to do a paper launch, to be honest. But they apparently haven't. They're still in stock, and you can buy them. And I think it's actually really good timing because they're having a hard time selling standard CPUs.
So if you need a new PC because you can't buy a graphics card, your choices are either get an Intel chip, which has integrated graphics, or buy one of AMD's 5000 Cezanne GPUs.
But the Intel
APUs.
Chip with integrated graphics
their integrated graphics are
they're
not good.
They're not even in the range of these Ryzen chips. So.
They're about half as fast, I want to say.
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Jared, as our graphics guru. What are your thoughts on, where we are right now in terms of integrated graphics? I mean, the 5700G is the faster one, but just, in terms of the speeds available and the prices available.
One of the interesting things that always seems to kind of people wonder about with integrated graphics is like, well, why don't we have faster solutions? Why don't we have, look at the PlayStation 5, look at the Xbox Series X, like those are basically an APU, and they're pretty much like, I want to say the Xbox Series X is going to be close to a Radeon RX 6700 XT, so faster than the 6600 XT that launched here. The PlayStation's going to be a little bit slower than that, but still probably faster than the 6600 XT. And you go, well, how can a PlayStation and an Xbox do this? And the reason is because they sell the whole hardware as a package, so you get this integrated memory. And memory is super important. Memory bandwidth is super important for graphics. So both the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 have like 16 gigabytes of memory. And I want to say it's like 760 gigabytes per second of bandwidth on, I think that might be the Xbox Series X, but it's in that like 600-700 range of gigabytes per second. Your system memory, even with DDR4 3200 running in dual channel mode, is 51.2 gigabytes per second. I mean, it's orders of magnitude slower, or an order of magnitude slower than what you get in a console. So, I think the DDR5 transition that's going to be coming up later this year and next year, integrated graphics could get faster, but the problem is still like you're looking at a 128-bit bus running at, maybe 6,400 gigabits per second, whereas graphics cards are running 256-bit buses at 16 gigabits per second. So there's still a big jump in bandwidth, and you reach the point where it's like with DDR5 systems next year, we could legitimately have integrated graphics that would be at maybe like the GTX 1650 level. But there's still also a big chip. Like once you put a GPU that size into a chip, you go, well, gosh, we could have made a faster CPU and then get a dedicated graphics card and have more power to play with. So like integrated graphics will pretty much never overtake discrete graphics on the PC
absolutely
space.
when it comes to, and when it comes to they'll never match, because they'll just crank up the power. They have more of a power envelope in the discrete form factor.
Yeah, it's like, why isn't your smartphone as fast as your laptop, and your laptop's not as fast as your desktop? It's because they got the power to burn.
And then with consoles, they have two other advantages. One is that price. They don't make money on them, or at least intend to, early in the cycle, and they last for extremely long cycles, so they can amortize the cost over a long period of time. But they are perfectly fine with losing money on it. So
because they also control the stores on them, so they make 20-30% off of every game sold.
Correct. So they're not as worried or concerned about the hardware costs. And then the second is they're designing it for one specific use case, gaming. They don't have to worry about compute. They don't have to worry about how it runs Office, or how it runs this, or how it runs that. It's a very specialized machine. And
these days they're not really, right? Like, a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox Series X, like, they're basically a PC hardware with a little bit of fine tuning and without Windows.
Well, yeah, but they're still not going to, if you just took them out and ran Windows on them, they're still not going to run as well in as many things. Especially when you look at the memory, right? So
I would love to see a PlayStation 5 that's been hacked to run Windows. Like, I think
it
would actually be pretty impressive.
We'll be doing something very similar to that very soon, as a matter of fact.
That's true. That's true.
Stay tuned. So Paul, you talked about this is a great chip to do some overclocking with. Ruru2 mentioned, they commented, don't cheap out on the motherboard. Get ones that can overclock for these. Do you have any recommendations in terms of what sort of, minimum motherboard needs you would have to, play with overclocking here?
I mean, these are 65-watt chips. They're not gonna push up too high even after overclocking. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but I can tell you what we recorded at overclocking. I think that most boards will actually be just fine with these. Again, with this class of chip, if you're spending too much on your motherboard, you're kind of losing the point. And then in order to use that much power, you're going to need a more expensive cooler. And these are more on the value range. So, I don't think you're going to see much more than 90 for sure. I think we peaked at 80, 88, 89. That's overclock with PVO. I mean, you can tune it manually and you can go higher. Sure, maybe hit 100 watts. But as far as motherboards go, that's not going to be too hard for most motherboards to feed to the chip. So, I mean, you would want to be cognizant of it, but it's not like it's a 5900X.
And you don't need to be like, you don't even need to get like the X570, right? Because the B560.
X570 doesn't make any sense for this class.
No, because you don't even get the PCI Express Gen 4 anyway.
Yeah, and it's just far too expensive. So you can get away with most enthusiast class motherboards, even in B series, are going to be fine. I mean, there'll probably be folks who would argue that you could, even on the cheapest, could do pretty well with this chip. So.
Great.
For my builds, I'm like, if you're going budget or at least mainstream, I think something in the $150 price range from, one of the big tier 1 OEMs, Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, like you do that and you're usually safe.
Yeah.
Of course, we have our motherboard recommendations and testing on tomshardware.com, so you don't have to do too much guesswork on your own. We got all the testing done for you. Speaking of, I did just share the link to Paul's 5600G review in the chat. I called him POC by accident, but it's Paul Alcorn. It's his review. There are no POCs. There are no POCs at Tom's Hardware. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone who's been watching. Please don't forget to like us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, wherever you see our name, just like it so you can stay caught up on all the Tom's Hardware fun. And we also make every episode of this show available as a podcast. So thanks to Jared and Paul, our GPU and CPU experts, respectively. That is our show. We'll see you next Thursday.